The wind came off the Shropshire Hills that last morning of October with a particular cold authority. And it was the wind that started everything, though no one standing in the Ashford Park kitchen garden could have predicted that a flying hat would rearrange the course of two lives before November's first frost. Cecily had been watching the man called Mr. Ellis for perhaps 10 minutes before the wind solved the problem of what to do about him. He was working along the far wall where the espalier pears had come loose from their wires, a task that required both hands and considerable concentration, and she had been pretending to consult her small leather notebook while actually noticing the way he worked with the kind of unhurried precision that suggested a man who had never once been told to hurry. His coat was brown and serviceable and did not fit him quite right across the shoulders. His hat was an old thing with a low crown, suited to a working man in foul weather. Then the wind came under the garden wall and took it. The hat spun upward, performed a brief, undignified arc, and landed in the dormant lavender bed not 3 feet from where Cecily stood. She looked at it. She looked at him, because he had turned at the exact moment of the hat's departure and was watching its trajectory with an expression that was entirely impossible to read, but that struck her, in the half-second before she laughed, as the face of a man who had never before been caught at a disadvantage and was not certain he approved of the experience. She laughed anyway. It was not a polished drawing-room laugh, or the careful, suppressed variety expected of young women in company. It was a plain, unguarded laugh, the kind that happens before the mind has time to intervene, and it lasted only a moment before she stopped herself, picked up the hat, and walked it over to him. "The lavender broke its fall," she said. She held it out. "There is a small bruise on the brim." He took it from her without hurry. He looked at the brim, then at her. "So there is," he said. "Thank you, Miss Marsh." He knew her name. She had not introduced herself. She filed that detail in the same notebook where she had been pretending to write, the mental one, and walked back toward the house with her actual notebook under her arm, and her breath still light from laughing. She had been at Ashford Park for 4 days. Her mother had arranged it, as her mother arranged most things, with the combined efficiency of a woman managing a limited budget and a daughter she considered an unresolved liability. Lady Marian Marsh was the widow of a Shropshire vicar of no great estate, a woman whose social pretensions had always outrun her circumstances, and whose management of those circumstances had increasingly come to rest on the question of Cecily's marriage. Cecily was 23, and in her mother's arithmetic, this was not a description, but a warning. The invitation to Ashford Park had come through the steward, a Mr. Godfrey, who had made it available to several families of modest gentility during the Earl's absence. It was the sort of arrangement that the period's country house etiquette permitted without much fuss, and Lady Marsh had accepted with a speed that left little room for Cecily's private reservations. Ashford Park was a handsome estate in the rolling country west of the county town, its house built in the previous century of pale limestone that had weathered to the colour of old cream. The grounds ran to something over 400 acres, with gardens, a walled kitchen yard, a small lake of clouded November water, and a library that Cecily had discovered on the first afternoon and returned to every morning since. The library was the reason she had not objected more vigorously to the visit. It was a long room on the east side of the house, shelved floor to ceiling on 3 walls, with 2 tall windows that looked out over the lawns toward the distant line of beeches. The collection was old and deep and arranged with the kind of idiosyncratic personal logic that suggested a reader rather than a decorator had done the work. Cecily had found on the 3rd shelf from the left of the north wall a copy of Cowper's letters she had never encountered before, and, beside it, a natural history of the Shropshire Hills so specific in its observations that she had spent an entire morning reading descriptions of stone formations she could see from the window. It was in the library, on that same third morning, that she had first noticed anything worth noticing about Mr. Ellis. She had been seated at the writing table near the east window, the natural history open before her, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path below, and looked out to see a man crossing toward the kitchen garden, with a coil of training wire over one shoulder and a canvas bag in his free hand. He moved with the unhurried precision she would later recognize, and something about the set of his shoulders against the pale October sky had snagged her attention in a way she could not immediately account for. She returned to Cowper. She returned to the window twice more before admitting to herself that it was the posture, not the man, that was striking her as wrong in some small, specific way she could not name. A working gardener, she told herself, and went back to the letters. She did not meet him face to face until that second afternoon, when she had taken the long path around the walled garden and come upon him where the south wall met the old gate, replacing a broken hinge with the same quality of concentrated attention she had observed from the library window. She had said good afternoon, because she said good afternoon to everyone, and he had straightened, touched the brim of his hat, and returned the greeting in a voice that was measured and unhurried, and quite without the regional broad vowels of the estate's other working men. She noticed that too. She walked on. By the fourth morning, the morning of the hat and the lavender and the laugh, she had a small private list of things about Mr. Ellis that did not fit his coat. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, was the only person at Ashford Park who seemed entirely unsurprised by anything. She was a compact woman of perhaps 55, with grey hair dressed plainly, and eyes that managed to be simultaneously watchful and kind. She had the manner of someone who had been in service in a great house for long enough that she had stopped performing the role and simply inhabited it. And Cecily had taken to spending part of her mornings in the housekeeper's room when the library felt too solitary, partly for the warmth of the small grate and partly for Mrs. Holt's company. On the morning after the hat, Cecily mentioned Mr. Ellis in passing, the way one mentions weather, as something observed rather than pursued. Mrs. Holt looked up from the linen inventory she was consulting and said, "He has been about the grounds this week for the wiring. He knows the kitchen garden well." "He does seem to," Cecily agreed. "He knew my name without an introduction. Mrs. Holt returned to her inventory with the same placid efficiency. Mr. Godfrey would have told him the guests' names. This was reasonable. Cecily accepted it and poured her second cup of tea. It was in the afternoon of that same day that her mother told her about Sir Aldous Fenwick. Lady Marsh had the gift of delivering unwelcome information with the practical brightness of a woman announcing the week's menus, as though the thing itself were simply a logistical matter that only a person of unsuitable temperament could object to. She was seated at her embroidery frame in the smaller of the two drawing rooms, a room that faced west and caught the late October light at an angle that turned everything inside it amber and slightly unreal. "Sir Aldous Fenwick will be visiting the county the week after next," she said without looking up from the silk on her needle. "He has asked, through a mutual acquaintance of your Aunt Philippa's, whether it would be convenient for him to call here. I have written to say it would." Cecily set down the book she was carrying. "I am not acquainted with Sir Aldous Fenwick." "No, but you will be." Her mother separated two lengths of gold thread with the careful attention of someone who preferred not to complicate a simple task. "He is a baronet with an estate in Herefordshire. He has an income of some comfort and is prepared to consider a second marriage. He is looking for someone sensible and not too young." She paused. "He is 44. Cecily was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that her mother had learned over 23 years to interpret correctly. "Cecily," she said, and now she did look up, and her voice had dropped from practical brightness to something lower and more persistent. You are not in a position to decline every convenient arrangement that presents itself. Your father left us with very little that is not entailed. We do not need to review the specifics to understand the situation." "No," Cecily said, "we do not." She left the room with her book and her composure intact and went to the library. She did not read. She stood at the east window for a long time and looked out at the late afternoon grounds, where the beeches along the far edge were dropping their last leaves in slow, unhurried spirals. And she thought about the specific character of helplessness that came from being both intelligent enough to see a trap clearly and constrained enough that seeing it changed nothing about the trap. Mr. Ellis was crossing the south lawn below, his canvas bag over his shoulder, his hat restored to his head. He paused near the garden wall and looked up, quite naturally, at the sky. Then he looked, briefly, at the library window, though from that angle she doubted he could distinguish her from the shadow of the curtain. She stepped back anyway. The following days moved inside the particular rhythm of late October, on a country estate. Cold mornings, briefly warm afternoons, early dark. Cecily established a habit without intending to. She walked the kitchen garden path in the mornings when the light was good and the air clear and the frost had burnt off the grass. She sometimes encountered Mr. Ellis there. She sometimes did not. When she did, they fell into conversation without formality, the way two people sometimes manage who have each decided independently that ceremony costs more than it is worth. He asked her, on the second such morning, what she was reading. She told him about the natural history of the Shropshire Hills, and he listened with the quality of attention that is rarer than it sounds, which is to say he did not merely wait for her to finish speaking, but appeared to actually register what she said, including the part where she described an argument the author made about limestone formation that she found plausible, but incompletely argued. He asked a question about the argument that was specific enough to require thought. She gave the thought and answered him. He nodded once, a small, clean acknowledgement that told her she had said something worth acknowledging. She asked him on the third morning how long he had known this estate. He considered the question before answering. "A long time," he said. "You know the garden as well as the library," she said, because he had mentioned the library, once in passing, in a way that had planted itself in her list. "Both have changed over the years," he said, which was not quite an answer to her question, but which stopped her from pressing further, because something in how he said it suggested the question had been understood in a fuller sense than she had intended. On the 6th day of the stay, she brought him a cup of tea from the kitchen without particular ceremony, because it was cold and he was working, and she was passing through with one for herself, and it seemed plainly unremarkable to bring two rather than one. Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen doorway when she did it, and made no comment. But when Cecily came back inside, the housekeeper handed her a biscuit and said, "You are very like your father sounds in how Mr. Godfrey describes him." Cecily took the biscuit. "Did you know my father?" "I knew of him," Mrs. Holt said. "A good man by all accounts." It was on the 7th day, the afternoon of the 7th day, that Cecily heard her mother's voice through the library door. She had not gone looking. She had been in the library all morning and had stepped into the corridor to return a volume to the small table near the door where she had left her hat. The corridor that ran from the library to the back sitting room had an arched ceiling that carried sound in both directions, with unusual fidelity, and her mother's voice came through the door of the sitting room as clearly as if she had been standing inside it. "The girl has no prospects beyond Fenwick," her mother was saying, in the clipped practical tone that meant she was not expecting to be overheard by anyone whose feelings would require managing afterward. "She will be managed accordingly, Mrs. Holt. I have been patient long enough, and her father's particular sentimentality about her doing exactly as she chooses is a luxury we ceased to be able to afford before he was cold in the ground. Fenwick is adequate. I require her compliance, not her enthusiasm. There was a pause, and then Mrs. Holt said something too low to carry, and then her mother again. I am not interested in her feelings on the matter. She is 23 and she has nothing, and she will do what is required of her, or she will find that my patience has a flaw. The corridor went quiet. Cecily stood with the returned book in both hands, the spine pressing into her palms, and did not move for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. She had known in the abstract the shape of what her mother intended. She had understood the arithmetic of her situation as clearly as her mother had laid it out in the amber drawing room. What she had not fully understood until this moment was that her mother discussed her as an item of domestic management with the housekeeper of an estate they were guests in, and that the language used was not the language of a woman who had once loved the daughter she was describing. She put the book on the table and walked out into the garden, because the library had become too small to breathe in. The kitchen garden path was empty in the sharp afternoon light, and she walked it once, twice, without a destination, letting the cold air do the work that thinking could not manage. The frost had come early to the north-facing beds, and the soil there was pale and crumbled, where it had thawed and refrozen along the edges of the winter cabbages. She stood by the south wall, both hands against the old limestone, and let herself be completely still. She did not hear him approach, but when she turned, Mr. Ellis was at the garden gate, not working, simply standing, and he had the look of a man who had come to say something, and was deciding whether this was the right moment for it. "You are cold," he said. "I am." She did not move her hands from the wall. "I was walking." He did not ask why she had been walking, or why she had stopped at the wall, or what was wrong with her face, which she suspected showed rather more than she would have preferred. He crossed the garden and stood beside her, not close enough to be forward, and looked at the same middle distance she had been looking at. "This wall is the oldest part of the estate," he said after a moment. "Older than the house by 60 years. The stone was cut from the north hillside." She looked at the stone beneath her fingers. The grain of it was coarser than she had noticed before, a slight roughness in the surface where centuries of weather had worked at the mortar lines. "The book mentioned the North Quarry," she said. "The natural history." "It would," he said. The author had a particular feeling for this valley. She looked at him then. He was looking at the wall, and his profile in the late afternoon light was composed and still, and there was in it, she thought, the same quality she had noticed in the kitchen garden on the first full morning, a kind of authority that had nothing to do with the brown coat or the canvas bag or any visible instrument of his station. She could not name it. She had been not naming it for 8 days. "Thank you," she said, not specifying what for, and he nodded in the same small, clean way he had nodded when she had answered his question about limestone. And then he went back through the garden gate, and she stayed a little longer at the old wall and breathed. Sir Aldous Fenwick arrived on a Thursday. He was a large man in his middle 40s, well dressed in the way of a man who thinks about his appearance and does not always succeed, with a broad face and the settled confidence of someone who had not encountered serious resistance in some years. He had a voice that filled rooms without effort, and a manner of addressing women that managed to be courteous and faintly evaluative at the same time, as though he were conducting a pleasant inspection that would eventually result in a report. He arrived in a hired carriage with a manservant, took the principal guest room that had been prepared for him, and joined Lady Marsh and Cecily in the drawing room that evening with the ease of a man who had accepted a good many invitations and found them generally satisfactory. He spoke about his estate in Herefordshire at some length. He spoke about hunting, which was the season's business, and about the difficulty of finding tenants of adequate quality, and about a recent improvement he had made to the drainage on his lower fields. He addressed remarks to Cecily with the faintly benevolent air of a man conducting an interview he had already decided to close in her favour, and she answered him in the level, plain sentences she always used, and her mother watched her from across the room with the particular alertness of a woman monitoring a mechanism she had wound and hoped would not require adjusting. Cecily was civil throughout. She had decided before he arrived that she would be civil, because civility cost her nothing, and told her things about a person that warmth sometimes obscured. What civility told her about Sir Aldous Fenwick by the end of the evening was that he was not cruel, not stupid, not unkind in any deliberate sense, and entirely uninterested in her as a person, in the way of a man who had already decided what a woman of her situation ought to be, and found the specifics of her actual self mildly irrelevant to the question. She slept badly. She rose early. She went to the kitchen garden because the kitchen garden had become the place where she could think without being watched, or at least with the sensation of not being watched. Mr. Ellis was not there that morning. She walked to the south wall and put her hand on the old limestone, and looked at the quarry stone, and thought about what it meant to be managed, and whether it was possible to continue being who she was, inside a life whose shape was being decided by other people. She was still at the wall when she heard the gate, and turned to find, not Mr. Ellis, but Mrs. Holt, wrapped in a heavy shawl and carrying a small covered pot of something that smelled of cinnamon. "Kitchen is not warm enough this morning," the housekeeper said, in the tone of someone who has not come to the kitchen garden to talk about the kitchen. "I thought you might want something hot." Cecily accepted the pot. It was a small porridge, the heavy winter kind, and the warmth of the ceramic through her gloves was a specific, present comfort in a morning that had offered very little of any kind. "Mrs. Holt," she said, because there was a question that had been sitting in her since that corridor 2 days before, and she was tired enough of carrying it that the discomfort of asking had become preferable to the discomfort of not asking. "Have you been in service here a very long time?" "All my working life, Miss Hay," Holt said, settling herself on the low stone bench near the south wall with the ease of a woman who had sat there many times before. "You know this estate very well." "Better than most," the housekeeper agreed, and looked at the garden with an expression Cecily could not entirely read. "It is a good estate. The house has been well managed." She paused for the length of a breath. "By those who care for it." Cecily waited, but Mrs. Holt only adjusted her shawl and said nothing further, and the questions Cecily had meant to ask seemed suddenly less important than simply sitting on the cold stone bench and eating porridge and letting the morning be the thing it was, which was cold and pale and, in its particular way, peaceful. She sat. Mrs. Holt sat. The frost melted off the cabbages. That afternoon, Lady Marsh informed Cecily that Sir Aldous would be speaking to her privately the following morning, before his departure. Her mother delivered this information with the efficiency of something settled, not proposed, and Cecily said nothing, which her mother interpreted, with long practice, as acquiescence. Cecily spent the evening in the library. She sat in the chair near the north shelves with the Cowper letters open in her lap, and did not read them. She looked at the room instead, the depth of it, the particular quality of the light from the 2 candles she had brought with her, the way the shadows gathered at the upper shelves where the oldest volumes were ranked. She thought about what she was going to say to Sir Aldous Fenwick. By 10 o'clock, she knew. He found her in the morning room the following morning, where she had chosen to be, rather than wait to be summoned. He came in with the comfortable confidence of a man completing an expected transaction, straightened his coat, and addressed her pleasantly. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I believe you understand the nature of my visit well enough that I need not be elaborate. I am prepared to offer you the position of my wife. Your circumstances are modest, which I regard as no obstacle to a reasonable arrangement. My estate is well maintained, and my intentions toward you are, I believe, entirely honourable." Cecily set down the small sprig of dried lavender she had been turning in her fingers, a remnant from the kitchen garden bed where his hat had not fallen. "Sir Aldous," she said, in the same level voice she used for everyone, "I am grateful for your consideration, and I understand that you are sincere in it. But I cannot accept. I hope you will believe that I have given it proper thought." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has encountered a mechanism that has refused to perform its expected function, and is genuinely uncertain whether the fault lies in the mechanism or the operator. "Your mother," he began. "Has views on the matter," Cecily agreed, "but the answer is my own to give, and my answer is no." He recovered his composure with the speed of a man who had learned that outward equanimity was the surest remaining advantage, made a short civil remark about hoping she would reconsider, and left the room. Lady Marsh came in 4 minutes later. The scene that followed was not short and was not quiet, and involved her mother invoking her father's memory, her own sacrifices, the specific weight of an entailed property, and the precise number of years Cecily had been a dependent, whose unwillingness to be grateful was a peculiar personal failing in an otherwise not unintelligent girl. Cecily stood through most of it by the morning-room window, her hands at her sides, and said, at the end only, that she was sorry to cause her mother distress, which was true and which was not the same as being sorry for her decision. Her mother left without pronouncing a verdict. Her absence from the rest of the morning was its own verdict. Cecily went to the library. The library was empty and warm from the morning fire, and she stood at the east window for a long time and felt the thing she had done settle around her, not like regret, not quite, but like the specific weight of an action whose cost you have calculated in advance and chosen to pay anyway. She had known what it would cost. She had paid it. She was still standing. She did not hear the knock at the library door the first time because she had her forehead resting against the cold glass of the window and was not attending to the room. The second time she heard it and turned. Mr. Ellis stood in the doorway. He was not carrying his canvas bag. He was wearing his brown coat but without the hat, and there was something in his standing there that was different from every prior time she had seen him, though she could not immediately place what had changed. He looked at her for a moment, and then he stepped fully into the room, which the working men of the estate did not typically do, and closed the door behind him. "I understand Sir Aldous Fenwick has departed," he said. She looked at him. "He has. I understand also that the departure was not the conclusion your mother intended." "It was not," she agreed. He was quiet for the length of several seconds, the measured, unhurried quality she had catalogued from the beginning. And then he said, "You did not have to tell me that. I am asking nothing of you, Miss Marsh. I wanted you to know that what you have done this morning required considerable courage, and that it has been seen." Her breath did something unsteady. She looked at the floor briefly, and then back at him. "You cannot know what I did this morning," she said. "I know rather more about this house than my coat suggests," he said. And something in the way he said it, the cleanness of it, the absence of evasion, planted a cold, clear certainty somewhere in the back of her thinking that she did not quite follow to its conclusion. She did not follow it because at that moment the door opened again, and Godfrey the steward put his head through with the apologetic expression of a man interrupting something he cannot help interrupting, and said in the direction of Mr. Ellis, "My lord, There is a rider from the estate office. He has a letter." The room went very still. Cecily heard the words. She felt them arrive in the order they arrived in, my lord, and then the rest, and she watched the man she knew as Mr. Ellis turned to Godfrey with the expression of someone receiving information rather than news, as though this moment had been located on a map he had been carrying all along. "Thank you, Godfrey," he said. "Show him to the study." Godfrey withdrew. The door closed. Cecily stood at the library window and looked at the man in the brown coat and the something in his bearing that had been wrong for the coat from the very first morning, and was now, suddenly and completely, explained. "You are," she said, and stopped, because the sentence did not need finishing. "Benjamin Barrett," he said. "Earl of Ashford, yes." The library held the silence with the quality of a room accustomed to holding things of consequence. "The natural history," she said after a moment. "The author had a particular feeling for this valley." "He was my grandfather's librarian," he said. "He lived here for 30 years. She looked at the north wall, the shelves, the books arranged by the logic of a reader rather than a decorator, and understood now whose logic it was. "Why?" she asked, and she meant all of it, the coat, the canvas bag, the broken hinges, and the espalier pears, all 3 weeks of it. He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone choosing a convenient answer, but in the way of someone deciding whether the true answer would be fairly received. "When the estate is let," he said, "I have sometimes found it useful to know who comes to stay in it, what manner of people they are, how they conduct themselves when they believe the lord of the house is absent." He paused. "I was interested in your mother's family in the particular way one is interested in a question that has already been answered. Your mother was not what interested me." She looked at him. "There is a laugh," he said, "that happens before the mind has time to intervene. I have not heard it often enough to be certain how rare it is. But I knew, when I heard it in the kitchen garden the morning after your arrival, that I had not been wrong to stay." The cold October light came through the east window and lay across the writing table and the Cowper letters she had left there open. And Cecily Marsh stood in the library of Ashford Park and understood that she had been watched, not in the manner of surveillance or assessment, but in the manner of someone waiting to confirm a thing they already half believed, and that the thing they were confirming was herself. She did not know what to say. She said nothing. He crossed to the writing table, not toward her, but toward the window beside it, and stood there the way he had stood beside her at the south wall, not close enough to be forward, and looked out at the grounds below, where the last leaves were coming off the beeches in the particular, unhurried way of a world that is not attending to anyone's schedule. "I will not press you," he said. "You have spent this morning defending your own judgment against a formidable opposition, and I will not immediately request that you revise that judgment in my favor. That would be impertinent." "It would," she agreed, and something in the acknowledgement made the corner of his mouth move in a way she had not seen it move before. "I would like to tell your mother," he said, "if you have no objection, that you are known to the lord of this estate, and that any arrangement made without your consent will require my opinion to complete. I would like to tell Sir Aldous, if the opportunity presents, much the same thing. And I would like to be allowed to ask, in the proper form, when you have had time to think, whether you might consider a different arrangement than the one your mother has been proposing." Cecily looked at the beeches through the east window. She thought about the lavender bed and the hat spinning against the pale sky, and the laugh that had happened before her mind had time to intervene, and about a man who had known her name before she introduced herself, and had asked a specific question about a limestone argument in a natural history, and had come to stand beside her at the oldest wall of his own estate, and offered her nothing except his unhurried presence in a cold afternoon. "I have no objection," she said, "to the first 2 things. And the third? She looked at him then, fully, the way she had been partly looking at him for 3 weeks. I have not had time to think yet, she said. No, he agreed. You have not. He left her the library, which was his library in an estate that was his estate, and she stood at the east window and looked out at the grounds and felt, for the first time in the 3 weeks since the carriage had come down the Ashford Drive, that the room she was standing in was not borrowed. Her mother's reckoning came that afternoon in the drawing-room that faced west, the amber room, where the late October light did its work of making everything inside it slightly unreal. Mrs. Holt had sent a message which brought Lady Marsh to the room with the expression of a woman anticipating a social call, and what she found instead was the Earl of Ashford standing at the window in a coat that finally made sense, and Godfrey beside him with the composure of a man who had been watching 3 weeks of this with considerable patience. The introduction was performed by Godfrey in the manner of someone who had been waiting to perform it since the morning of the flying hat, and Lady Marsh's face went through several distinct arrangements before settling on the one she judged most appropriate, for a woman who had been hosting the lord of an estate while believing the lord of the estate to be absent. Sir Aldous had not yet departed. He was in the entrance hall putting on his coat when the drawing-room door opened, and the name Benjamin Barrett, Earl of Ashford, was spoken in the carrying voice of a man who wished it to be audible in the hall. He came to the drawing-room doorway and stood in it for a moment and then withdrew without requiring anyone to manage his expression. Lady Marsh said, at some length, a variety of things that all amounted to the same surprised and recovering accommodation of a new social reality, and her voice had the quality it acquired when she was performing rather than speaking, which was slightly too bright and slightly too considered. Benjamin said very little in response. He was polite, which in a man of his position in Regency England was a complete and sufficient social instrument, and he was precise about one thing, which was that Cecily had conducted herself throughout her stay at Ashford Park in a manner that he held in the highest regard, and that any future arrangement concerning her interests would benefit from his awareness of that regard. He did not say this as a threat. He did not say it as a speech. He said it in the measured, unhurried way he said everything, looking at Lady Marsh with the same quality of attention he had given to Cecily's argument about limestone, which was to say he was fully present and entirely serious, and not at all in a hurry. Lady Marsh understood him. A woman who had spent 20 years in drawing-rooms knew when a door had been closed without being slammed. She said with the smoothness of a woman reconstituting her position from available materials that Cecily had always been a credit to her family, which Cecily, standing at the drawing-room doorway she had come to from the kitchen garden, heard without responding to in any visible way. Mrs. Holt, in the corridor outside the drawing-room, passed Cecily a cup of tea with a dry composure that contained, if you were attending to it, the particular warmth of a woman who has been waiting a considerable time for a specific morning to arrive, and finds that the morning has arrived on schedule. Sir Aldous Fenwick departed before supper, without ceremony, in his hired carriage with his manservant, and the sound of the wheels on the gravel drive diminished toward the gate, and was gone. 3 days remained of the intended stay at Ashford Park. They were 3 very different days from the ones that had preceded them, because the shape of the world inside the estate had shifted in the way that worlds shift, when a concealed thing is made plain. Not violently, not with drama, but with the quiet thoroughness of a reordering that turns out to have been inevitable since before the first morning. Benjamin did not press. He had said he would not, and he did not. He was present in the way he had been present through 3 weeks of brown coats and canvas bags, the same quality of attention, the same unhurried manner, the same posture at windows that suggested a man who had always known what he was looking at. He walked with Cecily in the kitchen garden on the morning of the first of those 3 days, and they talked about the natural history and about the north quarry that was the source of the limestone in the south wall. And he told her that his grandfather had planted the espalier pears the same year the wall was finished, and that they had never quite grown straight, and probably never would. "The natural history does not mention the pears," she said. "No, some things were considered too local even for that book." She looked at the pears trained against the old stone, their arms spread wide in the patient, persistent way of something that has been growing against a constraint for long enough that the constraint and the growing are the same thing. On the morning of the last day, she went to the south wall in the early light before breakfast, while the frost was still on the north beds, and the pale sky had the thin, washed quality of November coming in. She put her hand on the limestone and felt the grain of it, the centuries of weather in the mortar lines, the solidity of a thing built 60 years before the house that now stood beside it. She heard the gate. He came through it without his canvas bag, without his hat, in a coat that was his own coat, dark blue and properly fitted, and he crossed the garden to where she was standing and came to rest beside her at the wall with the ease of a man, returning to a place he has been many times before. "I have thought," she said. He waited. "I believe," she said carefully, because she had been careful with language her entire life and was not about to stop, "that I would like very much to know this estate further. The library has not been half explored." He looked at the wall. "The library has 400 volumes I have never catalogued." "That is a significant number." "It is," he agreed. "It would take considerable time." "It would," she said. The frost was melting off the cabbage beds in the slow, particular way of October frost when the sun finds it. The pears spread their arms against the old stone. The beeches at the far edge of the grounds were bare now, their branches the pale silver of early winter, and through them the Shropshire hills showed in long, cold lines that the natural history had described with the precise affection of a man who had spent 30 years learning to see what was in front of him. She laughed. She could not have said exactly why, except that the morning was cold and she was standing at the oldest wall of a house she had spent 3 weeks believing was borrowed. And the man beside her had stayed 3 weeks in a coat that did not fit to confirm something he had decided in the first 10 seconds after a hat went sideways in the wind, and a woman laughed before her mind had time to intervene. He looked at her when she laughed, the way he had looked at her in the kitchen garden when the hat was in the lavender, and his expression was the same expression, which was the face of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to keep it. "There it is," he said very quietly, as though he were completing a thought he had begun 3 weeks before. The cold morning held them both at the old wall, his estate spreading away behind them in the pale November light. And Cecily Marsh kept her hand on the limestone and let herself belong to a place without apology, the way the pears belonged to the wall, the way the quarry stone belonged to the hill it had come from, permanently and without requiring anyone's management of the fact.